is nothing!
So, how does this happen? World of Warcraft has been on my mind as of late, as it always seems to when a new expansion is announced. You're not getting my money, Shadowlands. Not yet. And while I've resisted the urge to give Blizzard another $60, I still like to keep up to date with the goings-on in the game because I find the world interesting, and also I'm too invested to back out now. The story in World of Warcraft has a lot of unique problems to deal with. Managing 20 plus years of lore, and rewriting, and retcons, while creating engaging storylines in each zone with memorable characters that flow well into an overall story. I mean, this game has to be a huge undertaking to say the least. This is why, in part, I feel slightly apprehensive when it comes to criticizing WoW's writing as a whole. I simply don't have the perspective to understand why some specific decisions were made and how to prescribe fixes when I don't know what constraints the writers were working under. What I want to do is narrow in on a very specific trope that's caught my eye. One that, while not unique to WoW, does seem to appear often in the game. I want to discuss what this trope looks like, its variations, and what it means for both writing in World of Warcraft specifically, and writing in general. It's time we talk about... Before we get into how this trope plays into World of Warcraft, let's go over what I mean when I talk about Crazy Woman Disease. There are a few factors that can increase your chances of catching the Crazy Woman Disease. The first being, of course, that you are a woman. If you're not a woman, you're in the clear. No sweat, you'll be just fine, bud. If you are a woman, I have terrible news. This news is going to get worse if you are a woman in a position of power, which is the second major factor that contributes to the proliferation of Crazy Woman Disease. The third and final factor that will cause your descent into Crazy Woman Disease is that you must suffer a horrible trauma. Either many small traumas or one big one. Take your pick. Now, how does this disease progress, and what are its symptoms? The main symptom of Crazy Woman Disease is, of course, the complete loss of logical or consistent thinking. A character who up until a certain point has been making, at the very least, consistent, morally justifiable decisions, will start to make decisions that seem totally out of character. Oftentimes, this will also be a huge shift in their moral philosophy as well. There will be seemingly no ethical justification for their actions, either implied or explicit. Characters who were major advocates for peace and reconciliation, or held deep, long-standing beliefs in certain ideals will just cast those aside in the quest for vengeance, or sometimes just because. Depending on how severe the trauma is, the process can happen slower or faster, and yet once it begins, it always must end. Oh, and how it must end. There are two ways that Crazy Woman Disease will terminate. The first is that the woman has grown too crazy and out of control and has to get put down like Old Yeller. Usually by a man. The second is that the woman has another pivotal turn in her characterization that makes her disavow her actions. Usually this is because a man told her to stop being crazy. Afterwards, she'll go mostly back to normal. There are only two main factors that will stop Crazy Woman Disease from taking hold. First is mind control, which renders the actions of the person meaningless. Take, for example, Kerrigan from StarCraft. Her actions after her trauma are functionally not her own. The Queen of Blades speaks, acts, and thinks as a different character, and thus beyond the shared body, this cannot be thought of as a development of the character itself. The character must be in control of her mental faculties to be considered for Crazy Woman Disease. This leads to my second disqualifying factor. The woman in question cannot start as already being crazy. Crazy Woman Disease is a process, and you can't start at the midway point. Bellatrix Lestrange in Harry Potter begins the story unhinged and ends the story equally insane. The audience is never given the opportunity to delve more deeply into her personality or see any kind of development. Since Crazy Woman Disease necessitates the development of illogical, out-of-character thinking, this would disqualify characters that start insane, or simply one-dimensional characters that don't have a real arc to speak of. There we go! Now that we got the bones, we can start getting into the meat of things. I do want to preface this upcoming section by saying that there are always variations when it comes to tropes like these. No one is going to write something that follows these points precisely, and honestly no one should. This is more of a framework to look at characters and see where their similarities lie. Now I know I did just say all that, but this first example is so archetypical of this kind of an arc that it would be silly not to mention it, and see the different steps in action. Let's talk about Daenerys. I know that everyone is desperate to forget about Game of Thrones after they shit the bed so severely with the last couple seasons, but in order to talk about Crazy Woman Disease, I have to talk about the Queen of Queens when it comes to heel turns, Dany. Dany, at the beginning of Game of Thrones, was one of the more unambiguously good characters that the show had. Her naivety and the cruelty she suffered because of her brother made her sympathetic, and her arc of having to grow into her role as Khaleesi and grow beyond that after her husband dies is genuinely really engaging. As Dany gains in power and influence, her goals begin to shift. She gradually begins to understand the scale of inequality, the breadth of despair the poor and the impoverished are subjected to. She seeks to break a system that harms those people and punish the people who benefited from it. This is one of her main motivating factors throughout her time in the show. Her kindness is not a political act, but one of genuine mercy that she engages in because she cares about the people beneath her. This idea of breaking the wheel is central to her whole philosophy. In order for this character to go against that philosophy, you would need another 7+ seasons depicting the fall of a woman who had spent more time than basically anyone thinking of and caring for the downtrodden. So, of course, Dany suffers a series of insanely spaced and horrible traumas that break her entirely, and she does strafing runs of King's Landing, killing everyone and turning into fantasy Hitler, with red and black banners to boot. After Dany's brief foray into civic planning, she's gone beyond the pale when it comes to Crazy Woman Disease, and as we know, there's only 2 ways for this disease to terminate, and, well... So, as we can see, Daenerys ticks every box when it comes to Crazy Woman Disease. She's a woman in a position of power. She was initially portrayed as a hero, or at the very least had morally justifiable decisions. She had logical and consistent thinking, and then she suffered a terrible trauma and has a heel turn that completely changes her personality and internal philosophy. This all terminates with her getting put down for the greater good. The only part I would concede as being a bit ambiguous is where the turn for Dany actually happens. The obvious choice would theoretically be when the bells ring and she begins to attack King's Landing, but I would argue that's more of a point of no return for her. Her first real turn is that one scene with the coffee cup in it. You remember that? No? Well, whatever. Dany feels a little dejected because everyone is lapping praise upon Jon Snow, and she gets up and storms off while everyone in the string section falls on every foreboding note that they can find. It's the first real indication that Dany caught the bug, and it progresses faster and more severely than we could have ever anticipated. Another thing I'd like to point out about Dany's story is that the writers try to justify their decision to make her go crazy by retroactively reframing some of her decisions as bad or portentous. Tyrion, in the last episode of that show, speaks to Jon Snow about the people that Daenerys killed to get to where she is now.
Everywhere she goes, evil men die, and we cheer her for it.
Is the line that he uses, and thinking about it now, it is just as stupid as when I first heard it. I bring this up because this element of reframing decisions characters make as having some darker undercurrent that we just never saw until it was too late, this idea comes up again. The problem is, it doesn't fix anything. It creates a confusing story in the moment because characters are making decisions that seem out of place, and then it tries to trick you into thinking that it was some kind of big brain, long con plan. It's unsatisfying regardless. Now that we have a frame of reference for Crazy Woman Disease, we can begin to talk about Warcraft, and we can begin to talk about Sylvanas. Sylvanas has a long history with the Warcraft franchise. Her first appearance was almost 19 years ago in Warcraft 3: Reign of Chaos. To go into every piece of detail about her backstory and lore would take ages, so I'm going to summarize the main points for people uninitiated and then continue from there. Sylvanas Windrunner was the general of the High Elves who helped defend her people against the encroaching army of the undead led by this asshole Arthas. She battles him multiple times before finally falling in battle to him and being resurrected as an undead banshee. Quick important note. Sylvanas is aware of what is happening around her, but completely under Arthas' control, so she has to watch as Arthas scuttles the cities she's sworn to protect, kills her people, and cuts them off from the well of magical energy that's keeping them alive. Eventually, Arthas loses control of her, she regains her body, she tries to double kill him, fails. Arthas goes up north to hang out in a big ice castle with Elsa for a bit. Sylvanas now has free will again, and so do a whole bunch of other undead. She's threatened by a big goat demon, kicks his ass, and he joins up with her. She continues to lead her newly united undead forces against the brothers of the goat demon dude. She kills them and establishes a newly free-willed undead as the Forsaken, whose capital city lies in the ruins of the old human kingdom. Sylvanas fucks about for a few years, building spooky caves and, I don't know, writing tax codes. What exactly do the leaders of these nations do? Not important. What is, though, is that Sylvanas joins up with one of the two major factions in the game, the Horde. She helps the remnants of the old High Elves, now called the Blood Elves, join the Horde as well. Arthas wakes up from his refreshing ice nap and is trying to get really nasty up on Azeroth again. Sylvanas has beef with that, and obviously with him on account of the whole, killing her thing. She defeats a coup within the Forsaken and helps to defeat Arthas along with the Alliance. She then throws herself off of Elsa's ice castle to her second death. She dies, goes to hell, and hey, she's back now, and she's fucking pissed. Basically, after this point, she does some betrayals and some war crimes and instigates more and more conflict with the Alliance, and things seem like they actually might be turning around when another world-ending threat shows up in Legion and Sylvanas and the Horde have to work with the Alliance. Sylvanas is, at this point, the Horde's leader. Except that gets squared away pretty fast, and also Sylvanas spent a good amount of time trying to enslave a Valkyrie goddess. And after Legion, it's just, oops, all war crimes. Everyone hates Sylvanas, and she quits the Horde to go fly off and join the Big Chad Super Devil as he attempts to destroy existence. Phew. Alright. You know all that now. Sorry about that. Anyways, let's take stock of where we are. Sylvanas passes the first two hurdles with flying colors. She has always been in a position of power in some capacity, even when she was alive. Likewise, her thought process for most of the games has been fairly consistent and readable. She puts the Forsaken first in her mind, like how she used to put Quel'Thalas. She participates in the politics of the Horde only because it offers protection for the Forsaken. Selfishness and lust for power have never been a major motivating factor for Sylvanas. Those ones are easy. The next point is more contentious. Unlike Daenerys, Sylvanas started off as being morally ambiguous and only recently has dipped into cartoonish evil. Her campaign in Warcraft 3 shows the decisions she made when establishing the Forsaken, and quite a bit of it involved the unrepentant murder of her enemies and potential enemies. You can argue whether these actions were justified, but ultimately the game never depicts anything that Sylvanas does as being unabashedly evil. The change in how the narrative frames Sylvanas is a recent development. From Cataclysm onwards, WoW frames the decisions Sylvanas makes as being evil regardless of how justifiable they are or aren't. This loss of ambiguity hurts Sylvanas' characterization and impacts the story as a whole negatively. Sylvanas follows a bit of a strange, drawn-out arc as compared to the other characters with Crazy Woman disease. Traumas marked Sylvanas' life and undeath constantly, and she was consistently harrowed by the specter of Arthas. After her ascension as the first Queen of the Forsaken, she had to make political moves in order to secure the safety of her new people, who, up until recently, had been the monstrous slaves of an undead king. This is a writing space that has a lot of interesting areas to go. Someone given leadership through circumstance rather than want. Someone who has to contend with the philosophical implications of undeath and what that means for her and her people. Someone who has to maneuver in the world of politics when most everyone sees you as a literal monster. On a personal level, dealing with her feelings of vengeance against the monster who stole her life, her free will, and her people from her. How does one contend with that? How do you make your peace with that? In Sylvanas' case, it was written that after Arthas was destroyed, she simply didn't care anymore, because apparently she had only ever cared about getting revenge on him, and she proceeds to throw herself off of a mountain. She's resurrected through a contrivance, and thus begins her descent into making insane decisions for the sake of being a villain. I would mainly like to ask, what have we lost, and what have we gained by pushing Sylvanas' character in this direction? I can't go into as much detail with Jaina and Tyrande because it would kill me, and also because they follow very similar paths with some variation. Both appeared in the same game where Sylvanas first appeared. Both were major political leaders that suffered their fair share of victories and defeats, personal anguish, and hardship. Both had a major tragedy that befell them. In Jaina's case, it was the destruction of her city where she ruled and where the people looked up to her by the hands of a war chief of the Horde, and for Tyrande, it was the destruction of her city where she ruled and where the people looked up to her by a war chief of the Horde. They both sought revenge against the people that did this to them. Jaina managed to survive her bout of Crazy Woman disease after a man told her that working together is good, insightful words to be telling a former diplomat. At the time of writing, Tyrande is still in the midst of her fight against Crazy Woman disease, and it does not seem to be going super well. She continues to get crazier and angrier and make less rational decisions. All she needs to do now is commit a war crime, and Crazy Woman disease will have hit its terminal phase, and she'll have to get put down like Old Yeller. I find it pertinent to mention that these three women, who all showed up for the first time 18 years ago, are the female faces of WoW. Yet somehow, their personal character arcs have all managed to follow a very similar structure. Crazy Woman disease is not a problem that WoW suffers from uniquely. It was the reason I brought up Game of Thrones at the beginning. WoW's issue is that barring these three women, there are not a lot of notable female characters amongst the main cast. Sure, there are plenty of women in the lore, or as quest givers strewn throughout the land, and there have been some new interesting female characters popping up from expansion to expansion. However, in terms of emotional investment and just time on screen making active decisions, these are some of the only relevant women in WoW. This makes it all the more weird and glaring that their stories have so many parallels. A quest for revenge that takes a character down a dark path makes sense once, but 3 times? Why? The first why we ought to be answering is, why do you care about this? Perhaps it's a kinship I feel with these unhinged women. I mean, you can't be fully normal if you're making video essays on the internet. The more interesting why we ought to be answering is, why does this matter at all? Talking about this matters because how we write stories matter. We've had 18 years with these characters, and if the WoW servers went off tomorrow, and they had no more novels, or comics, or tie-in material, if we were just left with the plotlines that we had, what would we look back and see? We would see 3 main female characters who come from different places, experience different lives, love different people, went through different hardships, all of them being pushed along a path that rendered the complexity of the emotional weight of their experiences moot. It took all the interesting history that they went through, good and bad, and made them into the same character. Crazy Woman disease seems to do this. It sands down these characters, it shallows their moral complexity, their internal lives, and their philosophies into something much more digestible and far less satisfying. I can't simply point to a root cause of this trope and say, there you go. All these stories are different, the use of this trope is different between them, and the severity to which their individual stories were harmed is highly debatable depending on who you ask. What I can point out about Crazy Woman disease that might be interesting to think on is that all the women I've talked about in this video have been leaders who have been overcome with powerful emotions. Professor Victoria Brescal, in her article detailing the ways that people perceive women in power, concludes that, compared to men, women are oftentimes viewed as less able to control whether their emotions influence their thoughts and behavior. And women are also more likely than men to be penalized for expressing emotions that convey power, e.g., anger and pride. Is it that much of a stretch to conclude that these attitudes towards women and their capacity for leadership influence how we write about them, even the fictional ones? Ultimately, we don't really have men suffer the same way that women do. There seems to be some desire to simplify the emotions and arcs of women down to a kind of hysteria. Does this perhaps say something about our own capacity to deny the emotions and trauma of women? I'm not really qualified to speak on that. I would say, though, that it would be wise to be thoughtful in terms of how and why we make these sorts of turns for characters. We should ask ourselves if we're doing it because it makes the most sense for the character that's been constructed, or if we're doing it because it's easier than having to deal with the vast emotional and psychological trauma we inflict upon these fictional women. In the end, there are no true consequences for this. The stories are there, and we can't unwrite them. The only thing that we can do is look towards them for inspiration and guidance. If they overuse a trope, or fail to realize a character to the fullest extent, no one is harmed, no lives are lost. If anything, it's a good thing. It provides everyone with an opportunity to learn from them, and to use that knowledge as they please. It's also important to realize that these stories, especially ones with the breadth of WoW, are more than a single character or a single trope. Your enjoyment of them can come from many different sources. Yes, I have problems with the direction that the story has gone in WoW, but it still manages to have moments that make me feel invested, and make me feel something. I think back on the last expansion and on a small cutscene with Jaina. She has this great emotional scene that culminates in her shouting,
"My own brother. I had thought better of you, Bane. So tell me, is he the Banshee's puppet? Crammed full of blight? Is he the bomb this time?"
a reference to her big turn and how she lost her home. It's good writing with fantastic performance. I really enjoy that scene. It also wouldn't have been possible without Crazy Woman disease. hey, thank you guys so much for watching the video. I know that this is kind of different than anything really that we've ever done before on the channel, but this is the kind of content that I'm really into, and I'm really glad to be able to make something similar to it. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. But yeah, I'd really also like to hear what you guys think about this. This is a little bit contentious as a topic, so if you have thoughts about it, please feel free to put them down in the comments. I'll probably read them. Or maybe I won't. In any case, if you're looking for more lighthearted content, we have plenty of stuff on the channel. And if you're looking for more of this stuff, give us a subscribe because I'll probably be making more of this in the future. Extra special shout out to Bear Almighty on YouTube. He has all of these videos that detail all of the different Warcraft characters and like all of their cutscenes, and saved me a significant amount of time making this video. Because otherwise I would have had to go through and clip all those. So if you guys wanted to see the full story yourself and make your own judgments, feel free to check out his channel. He's got those stories in chronological order. It's great. But again, thank you guys so much for watching.